landmarks which are important to remember in pharmacology. For example, first of all, in the ancient to medieval time, we had the use of medicinal plants in Chinese, Egyptian, Greek, and Roman system, and at the same time in India we had Ayurveda, Unani, and then Siddha. In the Indian, there are many Indian landmarks which we will continue to discuss simultaneously. As I told about the Ayurveda, then we had this Charak Samhita, Susruta Samhita. These are like systemic. These were like systemic documentation and of medicinal plants and the treatments. So in the Indian context, we have like Ayurveda as we discussed, and then Charak Samhita, and then we had Susrut Samhita, and so these were the systemic documentation of medicinal plants. So in the ancient time we had many different system like Chinese, Egyptian, Greek, and Roman system, and at the same time in Indian context we had this Ayurveda, Unani, and Siddha. Next we will see what happened in the succeeding eras, like first of all in 1800, in 1805 we had the first isolation of morphine, from opium by Frederick Serturner. This was the first pure drug. So we have to remember that the morphine was first isolated in 1805 from opium by Frederick Serturner as a first pure drug. Then we had next landmark, that was between 1830 to 1870s. So these were the eras where we had like many different experimental pharmacology which were established, like for example Francois Magander and Claude Bernard and Rudolf Buchmi. These three names, it's very important to remember. Francois Magendy, Magendy. Then we had Claude Bernard. Then we had Rudolf Rudolf Bucheim. Then we had in 1872, that is Oswald Eskemetberg. He sets up the Institute of Pharmacology in Strasbourg, and he is also referred as father of modern pharmacology. So it's very important to remember the Oswald Eskemetberg. Sorry for my pronunciation, but Oswald Eskemetberg, he sets up the Institute of Pharmacology in Strasbourg, and he is also referred as father of modern pharmacology. Next, in late 1800s, we had first pharmacology chair in USA, John Jacob Abel, in the University of Michigan. He was the first pharmacology chair in United States of America. We have to remember the name, John Jacob from University of Michigan. Then in the early 1900s, we had the first discovery of adrenaline, and then insulin, and then we had barbiturates. Then these are like formulation of pharmacology as a discipline. So the first formal formulation of the pharmacology was in near about early 1900s, as evident from the discovery of adrenaline, then insulin, and the barbiturates. Then we had in 1928 we had the discovery of, it's a very important discovery, we had discovery of penicillin. And this during 1928 the penicillin was discovered by Alexander Fleming. uh, it was also referred as antibiotic area, antibiotic era, which begins in 1928. And then in 1941, in we had like Goodman Gilman, the famous book we always read about. In 1941, the pharmacological basis of therapeutics was published in 1941. This was the time when World War II was happening. So Goodman Gilman's pharmacological basis of therapeutics, it was first published in 1941. And then in the era of 1950s to 1960s, like 50s to 60s, we had like like various like clinical pharmacology was emerged as a specialized field. And then rapid drug development by pharma industry was also happening that time. 1950s to 1960, we had like clinical pharmacology emerged as a specialized field. Then we had rapid drug development by pharma industry. Next we will see what happened the next era we will discuss is, that is 20th century, which is very recent. So regulatory standards, clinical trials, mass production of antibiotics and vaccines were happening. So we had like regulatory standards were formed, and then we had the clinical trials, and then mass production of antibiotics, and then vaccines. All these were happening in the 20th century. And in the Indian context, simultaneously in the Indian context in the 20th century, we had Colonel R.N. Chopra, who is also referred as father of Indian pharmacology. He establishes the pharmacology as a discipline in India in 1921. So this is a very important name. Colonel R.N. Chopra, who is also referred as father of Indian pharmacology, establishes the pharmacology as a discipline in India. And in Indian context, in 1966, there is another event which is very important to remember, that is Indian Pharmacological Society was formed. IPS, Indian Pharmacological Society, was first formed in 1966. This is very important to remember. Next, in then there were various landmarks which were succeeded. For example, in 1970s to 1990s, the like biotechnology, and then HIV drugs, and global pharma expansion was happening. In 1970s to 1990s. At the same time, in Indian context, we had Indian pharma industry was rising. Indian pharma industry was rising, and then the companies like Cipla, Ranbaxy, Dr. Reddy's, and they all emerged as a global players in 1970 to 1990s. And next after 20th century, we had like it was succeeded by 1966, 1970s to 1990s era. And finally we have this 21st century, where we had this we were talking about the biotech industry, genomic, personalized medicine, and then CRISPR-Cas knockout system. And in Indian context, India recognizes of as far India like India as a country was recognized as a pharmacy of the world for generic and affordable medicine. So this was the whole thing, what like some of the major landmarks which we have to remember in the context of pharmacology. But at the same time, there are many other landmarks which I am not going in detail. But if you have any question, please write it into comment. We will look into it and we'll publish more detail.